So hello, everybody. So thank you so much for spending your lunch hour with us. We have three presentations that we're going to talk with you about our research. And I'll start because we want to make sure that we stay within our time frame and that we have some time for question and answer. So I will start our conversation, and let me pull up my slides, and then we could move forward on that one. Okay, let's see. Roxy, can you see that? Let me get this in slideshow presentation.
Yes, you're good.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. Okay, so folks, I'm going to share with you some research that I've actually been engaged in the last 2 years. So a little context prior to that. I retired, as retirements go, from K-12 education after 33 years. And part of the work that I did just prior to my leaving K-12 is working with college and career pathways, and specifically the link learning pathways here in the state of California. And so I started this work looking at how do these college and career pathways provide access for emergent bilinguals. And what I found in my dissertation is that they don't, that there is a barrier that is ingrained in the system, to sort of speak, regarding language, and how the assumption is that students must have a higher proficiency of English proficiency before they could access any of these co-curricular or extracurricular programs, and specifically these pathways. And so my study took me to a link learning school, Antioch High School. That's one of the 9 original schools that started the link learning career pathway program. And so my topic is college and career readiness for emergent bilinguals using a contextualized English language development and ELD curriculum in a link learning pathway. Let me get here. So my colleagues and I, Teresa Ordóñez is the founder of Ánimo Success, which is a program supporting English learners. Sylvia Ramirez is the coordinator, the ELL coordinator in Antioch High School. Louis Rocha is the principal. And then starting with Kelsey, Chelsea, Anne, Janine, and Jamie, they're all teachers in the multimedia technology pathway at Antioch High School. So they all participated in this study. So significant findings from my dissertation, as I started to share earlier, is conflicting language acquisition policies. And then those policies had an impact on recommendations for link learning, or CPAs, which is the California Partnership Academies, those to explore the development of contextualized instruction in the core content and technical courses. Now, this has evolved a little bit further, and currently my study is looking at content-based teaching and learning as a growth out of this concept of contextualized instruction. And so we piloted this research project at Antioch High School with the Media Technology Academy. So it's real important to know that in the pathway programs, there's core teachers in these programs. And what we found is that oftentimes it consists of an English, social studies, science, math teacher, the technical teacher. But what it did not include someone who can assist and support in language development. And so there's an interdependence really of college readiness or career readiness. And that is that we look at the college and career readiness standards. We look at the anchor standards for that, and they're all identified now in the K-12 dashboard as one of the indicators of college and career readiness. And so we took a look at, what are all these components? The LTEL is long-term English learner. So a long-term English learner is a student who's been in the US school for longer than 6 years and has not been reclassified as English proficient. So I took this piece right here of language acquisition out, and that became the focal point of this study here. And so again, I mentioned earlier that the typical matrix of a pathway is that you do have these core content programs, curriculum, but what you don't have is this person. You don't have this ELD strategist or an individual that helps the academy teachers develop integrated lessons with contextualized language instruction. And so this is now, this had become the ELD strategist has become now a member, if you will, of these pathway teachers. So, so what we did is we asked the school to provide a group of students, English learners, and the school selected, and this is something that goes with research. Oftentimes you want a certain group, but then the school makes a shift or a change, and then we basically are given what the school provides. So we were given 11 ninth graders at level 1, which is no English proficiency, very, very dominant home language, which was Spanish for this group of individuals. They were all placed in core academic classes and in the technical class. And so what we did is that we said, okay, so how are we going to integrate this model with language learners, level 1 English learners in this pathway? And so we did a three-prong approach. One is we worked with the teachers explicitly on language development strategies. We worked with the students in the program in an after-school support program, and the parents or guardians of those students, we met with them every other Thursday as a building capacity for them to understand the kind of like the US school model. So we took a look at a protocol that's called psyop, which is Sheltered Instruction Observation Protocol. It's been around in the state for a while. And we looked at these 4 focal areas. Now, psyop has 8 content areas, but our study concentrated strictly on lesson preparation, instruction, comprehensive input, and strategies. So this is the picture of the book that our teachers were using. And so what we did is we established a professional development series in which we provided a PD on one of the 4 competencies or components, not competencies, with the teachers. And then we would go into the classroom and conduct classroom observations in the 5 teachers' classrooms. And at the end of the day, we would invite the teachers to an after-school debrief sessions where we talked about what was observed and what was specific about the strategy that we were observing in the classroom, and for them to get feedback on how we perceive the implementation of that strategy. And that went on for 6 months. The duration of the PD and classroom observation was a 6-month cycle. Started in September and ended in February. So again, I've already shared a little bit about that. What was interesting here is just the fact that we incorporated the English language development strategists along with the other core teachers. We implemented the psyop model, and we conducted these classroom observations using the psyop protocol as our matrix for implementation. So one of the areas that we significantly saw a big change is in biology. Again, the biology teacher has a Hispanic surname but did not speak Spanish. And so what we took is we said, okay, how can we have science teachers, math, all of them, but how can we have science teachers then unpack the science so we can start building language acquisition embedded in the content of their instruction. So this is the frame of what was coming. They were looking at the structure of DNA, how many proteins are in DNA, And how are the proteins made from the DNA? So that was the objective of this lesson here. But what we did is we said, okay, now let's adapt this lesson using the psyop model. And we based on lesson preparation. So what is the content and how are the students going to access it? And then what we also created is an opportunity for the teachers to always put content objectives and language objectives. And that was a significant inclusion. And that is, oftentimes teachers will say, this is a content objective for the day. But when you have language learners, you need to establish a language objective. What is it that you want to establish, a language goal to support your content goal? And in this case, visual and written information about the different parts of DNA, the molecules, and describes its structure. Another aspect of psyop is looking to build background. What do students know already from prior experience, and how can they bring that forward so they can pull that knowledge forward. So in this unit, they talked about what a Nobel Prize winner is. And the students then researched it. They went into what DNA is. So they got an understanding for kind of like the scientific application of how to analyze their data. So they had to analyze it. They had to complete a data table. They needed to determine, basic pairings of DNA in their PLC. And then this is another aspect of comprehensive input. How did the teacher break down the science unit to provide students with comprehensible input so they could then see these components about, what are the components of the DNA that they were looking for. The next slide here shows the three young ladies who were in our program of study, who were the winners of the Nobel Peace Prize. And what's significant about it is when these young ladies, along with the others, entered the program, they were monolingual Spanish speakers, did not speak English well at all. And this is now around February, and their English level has grown significantly. And of course, we think when you integrate curriculum that the students then get engaged in that. All right, so I'm going to try to move this slideshow a little faster here. So the integration of the Animo support with the contextualized learning was this, is that here's where we worked with the teachers. We worked with contextualizing teaching and learning with the teachers in the professional development. Then we worked with the students themselves in their after school program. And then we worked with the parents. So all three components here were all integrated in this program of study. So the parents knew what the curriculum was, the intent of the curriculum, objective of the curriculum. The students knew that's the same teachers. So this continuous circle was always moving around, informing all three components of that. So this is the after school program. It develops social and cultural capital in the middle and high school students. And again, providing equity and access. And we're looking at how do we provide access to students, specifically in this frame, how do we provide access to second language learners in high school to start accessing core academic courses that meet the graduation requirement. So the optimum-based framework for this program is, looked at college career readiness, personal empowerment, leadership and development, and the cultural validation. A little bit of what, but as President Jimenez Sandoval was talking this morning is what does a student, what does a person bring that we can validate their culture so they could see themselves in the curriculum, they could see themselves in the program of study. And that's one of the pillars of this program here. So we worked with the parents, we worked with the counselors, we worked with the school administration to provide access points for parents. A significant piece of information that was discovered is their communication home was all done in English. It was not translated into Spanish, and that was one of the one of the recommendations that we made to the school for that. There we go. So this is just an example of building cultural capital for the students. We worked on SMART goals. We worked on retaining their home language. That was a very strong piece of our work, is not to lose your home language. Definitely talk about the A through G requirements and so forth. Parents as well. We met with parents every other Thursday, and we talked about the school structure, how to access resources within the school, and then how to create a network of parents. So they became a strong network unto themselves about anything and everything that really supported them. So this is a linear continuum of teaching and learning. These are the pieces that we add. We changed the teacher pedagogy piece, the parent engagement, the student advocacy piece, and the leadership at the school, all to drive toward the access and equity opportunities for students there. Okay, questions? Any questions? Q&A. I'm gonna see what my time frame is. Okay, with no one sharing thoughts, I will stop sharing, and maybe one of my other colleagues then can start their presentation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mendoza. I am up next.
Okay.
And give me a second while I get situated.
Mm-hmm.
All right, can I get a thumbs up if you can see my screen? Thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. My name is Varoxy Borromeo. I am an assistant professor in the Higher Education Administration and Leadership program, and I don't know why my printer just started printing. Excuse that noise. I am here to present on one of my collaborative research projects that I'm working on with, or have been working on for the last 4 or 5 years, essentially. I'm a faculty affiliate with the National Institute for Transformation and Equity. The director of the center is Dr. Samuel Macias, who is also my dissertation advisor. And so we embarked on a study in 2016 to explore how private post-secondary institutions advanced change and transformation in the areas of diversity, equity, and inclusion on their campuses. And so I'm here to give you a little bit of an overview of what the focus of that study was. So we know that our institutions are diversifying, right? Our student demographics are diversifying by the minute, it seems. And so institutions have been focused on how they can transform their environments to better serve students in equitable ways. And so the issue or the problem at hand here is that institutional cultures, higher education cultures are difficult to change, right? And so exploring and understanding how culture shifts in areas of diversity, equity, and inclusion are warranted, because we need to understand how institutions are shifting towards becoming more equitable. Studying culture is difficult, especially highlighting cultural change. And so what we decided to do was we decided to utilize a symbolic frame. And I'm going to talk more a little bit about that later. But essentially, while culture is hard to define, symbols are visible aspects of an organization's culture. So in some sense, we're using symbol as a proxy for culture here, right? So we can investigate the relationship between symbols and organizational change, or at least that's what we're looking at in this study. The issue is there's a paucity in research in how organizational symbols facilitate change. And we're also interested in how power dynamics play a role in who or what becomes a symbol and how these symbols are interpreted differently by campus stakeholders. So we use the Bullman and Deal four-frame model. It's a pretty well-known model in research looking at how leaders use the structural, political, or human resources or symbolic frame to run and manage and lead their organization. So when we're talking about structure, we're talking about policies and procedures, task forces, right? How an organization is structured. When we're talking about the political frame, we're talking about power, resources, politics, essentially, on a campus or an organization and how it's run. Human resources frame looks at who, right? Like managing people, managing relationships to run an organization. The symbolic frame looks at fundamental elements of culture, right? Symbols, representation of culture. And of the four frames, the symbolic frame is the least explored or understood. And so when we're talking about symbols, we want to highlight, identify a couple of symbols, right? So heroes and heroines. So these are the people we talk about or uplift. These are symbolic figures in an organization. Usually there are positional leaders, right? They might be historical leaders, for example, as someone who started an organization, right? And then we have stories, the stories we tell about organizations, how an organization came to be, how higher education institutions were created. There's a saga here. So every institution, higher education institution has a saga, has a story, has a history, right? Rituals and ceremonies, an example of that are graduation, commencement. We're focused on that right now in the next couple of weeks. Those are the ceremonies that make up the culture of an institution. And so we can tell how strong the culture is in keeping to their ceremonies because we have such a strong focus or desire to have commencement happen because it means something for the culture of the institution, for the organization, and for the people in it. Artifacts are things such as flags, right? Flags as a symbol of, we're talking about mascots, physical artifacts such as buildings and monuments. Those are examples of some symbols and symbols. So the purpose of our study was really to critically analyze the role of symbols, right? Like what role do symbols play in organizational change? So we wanted to look at the range of artifacts. So we looked at diversity champions, the heroes and heroines. We looked at diversity structures, which are the artifacts. We also looked at diversity frameworks and strategic planning. And so these are the mission, vision, institutional frameworks institutions take on. And so our current analysis really focuses on expanding knowledge about what these symbols convey in shaping diversity, equity, and inclusion agendas. So these are our research questions. How do symbols advance or hinder DEI at for-profit universities? And then in what ways do power dynamics influence who or what becomes a symbol? So we employed case study methodology. We explored 4 different cases, essentially, for private institutions. We conducted qualitative interviews. We pulled websites. We collected programs and other physical artifacts for exploration. And so in identifying the 4 institutions, we looked at EdTrust college results online, and we looked at graduation rates between undergraduate graduation rates between white students and this is the term that they used here, underrepresented minority students. We were interested in the organizations that were closing the gap between those graduation rates because we were positing that these institutions were doing something specifically to close those rates so that students were graduating closer to parity between white and underrepresented students. So we used purposeful sampling in this process. What we did was we contacted 4 private post-secondary institutions and we conducted campus visits. So we visited about 2 days and we spoke to faculty, staff, and students. And these are the 4 institutions that we talked to. 3 of them were in the West Coast. 1 of them was in the Rocky Mountain area. And then you can see their what types of institutions they were. In the end, we spoke to 52 total participants across these 4 institutions. So it was about an average of 12 to 13 participants at each institution. What we did was, during data analysis, what we did was we developed institutional profiles of each institution. So we collected, first of all, we transcribed the 52 audio files through a transcription service. Then we developed a 2-page summary case profile of each institution, highlighting the history of the institutions, some of the major significant diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives on that campus. And then in phase 2, we conducted a priori coding based on Bullman and Deal's symbolic frame, right? So the 4 points here are how we coded for. We looked for dimensions of the diversity structure. In this case, we're diversity centers. We looked for symbolic figures, people who are mentioned a lot throughout the interviews. And so each of our research team members reviewed one institutional profile and their transcripts, and then another person reviewed, so that we ensured that at least 2 people reviewed the transcripts to make sure that we were coming to a consensus about what was occurring or coming up or emerging in the themes. And so I'm not going to go into too much trustworthiness or limitations, because I want to get to our findings. So there were 3 findings, right? So I want to have state a caveat, like we noticed or wanted to highlight the ways these institutions were utilizing symbols. However, we wanted to offer them up very holistically to explore how some participants talked about them positively. However, we noticed tensions in how people discuss these depending on their role on campus. So in a lot of cases, positional leaders like the presidents were highlighted as symbols of hope and opportunity, which wasn't not a surprise, right? In this quote here that I'm not going to read, I hope you have a chance to read it. This quote highlights how a staff member administrator was really excited about a president because they were coming in with a background. They symbolized a change and an opportunity for the campus. But what we also noticed was that while positional leaders were seen as symbols of opportunity, folks on campus who had been engaging in grassroots leadership for a very long time, who are often folks of color, were not highlighted as symbols, right? And so that was an interesting realization, because it highlights that the work of these folks are often invisibilized, and when we focus solely on the positional leaders. Finding number 2 is that diversity centers are often complicated symbols of commitment. Many of our participants talked about how our diversity centers were the place where diversity was supported and helped, right? And many of our institutions talked about this shift about bringing the diversity center to the center of campus, whereas before they were in an old dentist building at the edge of campus, right? And so people on campus would say, well, it shows how much the university values DEI if the diversity center was on the edge of campus or hard to access. And so there was a lot of movement to move things into the middle of the campus. However, perspectives about that were complicated too. While some people said that showed commitment, others highlighted still the fact that these diversity centers were still the only places that were responsible for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so what does it mean when only one area is responsible for diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the entire larger campus is not held accountable? Finally, in finding 3, we looked at how institutions engaged institutional frameworks or strategic plans. One of our presidents talked about how they considered the strategic plan as something that is a language, is a common language, right, to help guide diversity, equity, and inclusion on our campus. And while participants were able to, reiterate and state, yes, one of our strategic plans is diversity and equity, diversity and excellence, whether these participants owned the plan was a really, held some tension and complexities as well. So the other thing that participants talked about was there was some conflict with how these strategic plans were very idealistic, right? Very goal-oriented. However, the institution's history of, racial racism, of sexism. You know, these histories, cultures, and identities were not deconstructed well. So there was tension between the focus of the strategic plans versus the institution's history. For example, how does a faith-based institution deal with or navigate LGBTQ equity issues when there's a strong history of oppression of LGBTQ identified folks within some of that faith base, right? So some things that folks talked about. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. In terms of discussion, our findings confirm that, you know, symbols play an important role. However, symbols are social constructs and people interpret them differently, right? And so we would need to pay attention to who is viewed as a symbol on campus, who is not, and who is erased, whose stories and efforts are erased. We need to look at we need to complicate the extent to which diversity centers can be symbolic of commitment, but also highlight the tensions about who is included in doing the work and responsible for the work. I'm just gonna go through one or two of these points here. Just implications for research. We need to diversify the type of institutions that we're looking at. So we only looked at private institutions. It would be interesting to conduct this study with public institutions, right, with a different context here. And then, of course, in terms of practice, we're not advocating that we should not celebrate our diversity champions who are positional leaders, but we need to be attentive to power structures that unintentionally minimize the work of grassroots leaders. We also need to pay attention to the ways that diversity structures convey different symbolic messages to people on campus. And then we need to really explore understand how institutional frameworks and strategic plans can serve an important symbolic role as an orienting guideline for the campus, but consider who is invited to participate in this process. So that is all that I have for you, and I want to thank you for your time. Any questions? No questions, thank you. Dr. Maluli, would you like to share your screen?
Thank you, Becky. That was a great presentation. Greetings, everybody. Let me grab. Nice. Okay. Thank you for your time. Today, I want to talk about community development centers, and it'll make sense in terms of your educational leadership moment. Writhing within economic discontinuities in the San Joaquin Valley, educational work of community organizations and the disconnected youth they serve. In my title, I want to draw your attention to the first word, writhing. When we think of the word writhing, because struggling is the main word I was working with, but I shifted it to writhing for a very intentional purpose. Often when I think writhing in agony. But deeper still is inspiration I got from Margaret Mead. And I pay a lot of attention to Margaret Mead. She's the anthropologist who started the program at Teachers College, Columbia University, the Anthropology of Education program that I graduated from. Talking about anthropologists, she made this quote about lenses and how we study things. With these lenses acquired in the long months in which the anthropologist minutely studied strange ways of life and reflectively held small wriggling babies in their arms, where these babies of each society wriggle in a slightly different way. And one learns from observing these differences. The anthropologist sees different things about home culture. She goes on and on about it. But she's often been misquoted as saying wiggle instead of wriggle, the W, R versus WR. And her correction to it is something that has inspired me. She pointed out, like, if you grab a fish, it wiggle, spasmodically, just as a nervous system responding, like a victim. But babies wriggle, and they wriggle uniquely. And each of them, culture by culture, wriggles uniquely. But for us, what I'm trying to point out is that The subjects that I'm going to talk about, these disconnected youth, are not victims. They're not powerless. They're active agents. And though they be poor and people of color and low socioeconomic status, which puts them down and down on this totem pole, we can't forget that they are active agents in our analysis. Okay. Um, and so the subjects are called disconnected youth. In 2013, over 12% of youth ages 16 to 24 in the San Joaquin Valley were judged as disconnected in labor market statistics. That statistic is extremely conservative, frankly, from the data that we collected. Um, Nationally, if we look at economics, over the last many years, we see, patterns of unemployment for a similar age group, 16 to 19, not 24. But nothing rivals, what happened after the 2008 economic disaster that resulted in 2013, rates going past 25% unemployment. Um, this and this term disconnected youth that I'm going to be talking about, I want you to remember also that it is not something that these subjects are going to label themselves as. It is not a folk category. Rather, it is an analytic category. Like the great, David Schneider, he's a great kinship theorist at Chicago U. He always said that, kinship exists in the minds of anthropologists, not in the subjects we study. Similarly, disconnected youth is something that we use to help analyze a huge problem, outside of academia. So, but just to keep that in mind. So what are disconnected youth? It's again, the target is age 16 to 24, and they're not enrolled in school and they're not in the labor force. NEET is another, NEET is another word that's used within the public administration and the poli-sci data. Over the last decade, literature surrounding disconnected youth in the United States has developed a hypothesis that community institutions and networks are responding to the needs of disconnected youth, these community development centers. That's what the literature is arguing. The gap in the literature is that existing research does not provide an adequate understanding of these community development, these community institutions, and these networks, how their services and activities support disconnected youth, nor opportunities and challenges that they face. So that's where our study began. As in terms of an intentional look at these community development centers and what role they're actually playing in helping these disconnected youth get reconnected. Our study was it's funny, I often say this to students, our study was not ethnographic because ethnographic can't be used as an adjective. What anthropologists do is participant observation. We observe, we interview, we hang out, and we did this for 5 years actually, in 3 different cities throughout the San Joaquin Valley. The result of that is an ethnography. So ethnography is a noun. It works well as a noun. It doesn't work as well as an adjective. But the findings of this study also indicate that these organizations, help young people demonstrate resistance to patterns and systems of marginalization that they experience in local communities. Again, trying to focus on the agency of the actors here. These are not passive victims who need our help, whoever our is, and then we just give it to them. No, they're actually, active agents in, their future creations, and we need to be mindful of that. My why am I saying this to future educational leaders or current educational leaders? Because we play a critical role in this. In this endeavor that some of these disconnected youth could be reconnected to education. Many of them, that I interviewed, had finished high school or finished a GED and could readily, get into, a community college. And there's a lot of ways to get a free community college education now. Why aren't they? And so that's an invitation for us, I think, to consider. How can educational leaders reduce the flow of this disconnection? The school to prison pipeline is something we're all very familiar with. The school to work pipeline is something we don't really like to say. I think because of this, we're all progressive education. John Dewey has a huge impact on all of us in America. But due to the current crisis, and the high rates of unemployment and this disconnection of our youth, it might be time to seriously consider, more of these sorts of issues, in terms of thinking school is a means to work. I mean, that's not all it does, but that aspect of it might be, get a little hyper focus of late. It should. And why we got this study, why we got the funding for it, I did this study with, this was primarily out of UC Davis, a colleague of mine there, Ann Visser, and a couple of my undergraduate students conducted the research. But the funding, in part, was because, San Joaquin Valley is kind of like the canary in the coal mine. If it's bad nationally, it's worse here because, we have horrible challenges in San Joaquin Valley. The drought is, in fact, when we were doing this research, the drought was still having an effect on things. So Okay. Um, a three-way struggle is something I think about analytically when I looked at these data. And I take this from semiotics, from Charles Sanders Peirce's triadic model of communication, that it's not two parts, but there are three. There's often three actors involved. In this case, it's the clients, the disconnected youth themselves, the community development organization, and that's usually the only two you see, but there's always a theoretical third lurking there somewhere. And this is the model. It might be the city itself, it might be the entities that contain the city. It might be the donor. It might be, if these, because often these agencies are under either federal or state ordinance. And so that third actor is typically there as well as in terms of how I think about this analysis. So within this challenge, when the subject goes to the center, there is this thing. The members of the community development center have to determine what the client needs and what it can provide. The client, conversely, has to determine what they want and if they wish to receive what the community development center offers. That sounds obvious, but it's not. And I say this empirically from after our investigations. It's not at all obvious in some cases. Um, I initially and frankly naively was trying to, get an analytic frame that would make sense of the data, and I came up to legitimate peripheral participation. Gene Lave and Werner Lave had a great theory many years ago. It's not quite as popular in education now, but it's still very popular in workforce development literature. That this idea that participants move from outer to inner circles. That's the idea, in terms of legitimate peripheral participation. Which it was clearly developed by these folks. But my notion that this was going to happen, that people came disconnected, came to the workforce development center, as it were, helped get job training, and then got a job, and got to the core, that wasn't quite how things went. And it was kind of naive of me, I think. The sense these community centers are intended to prepare and train potential employees for the labor market. And what they ended up doing sometimes was hiring them directly. And the literature on the learning, really illustrates no indication that this sort of thing happened. That they're getting hired by the community development centers in some cases. Um, these, which were kind of strange, unexpected. The observations also illustrate, participation pathways from periphery to core that are illegitimate or accidental, is kind of the way that we analyze them as. Subjects arrived at, these organizations with one thing in mind and received something else in many cases. Some arrive as peripheral clients and leave that way. Others arrive as core employees and leave that way. But between those two poles is a great deal of variance that is best described as unpredictable. For example, one client, Emilio, started going to the center for condoms as a high school student. He later kept hanging around and eventually got a job at the front desk, which, among other things, he would hand out condoms. So he went to get condoms, and now he's giving them away. And again, it was these sorts of findings that kept coming up that really drew my attention to this, to the role that, the actual roles that some of these actors are playing and the agency that they have. But within this idea of roles, my intention is to illustrate the unexpected nature of these interactions. You go for one thing, something else happens, and why that's important. Some of this could help us as educational leaders, to think about how these centers can provide for disconnected youth or not, and how this can inform, the work of educational leaders, so as to ignite change. Again, if they're going for one thing and not getting it, and this is in no way to attack, by the way, the centers themselves. They're doing great work. They need more funding, frankly. But the interesting thing is, I think often in the policy language, people are forgetting that disconnected youth are actual people, that they have, opinions, that they realize they're being marginalized sometimes. They push against that rather violently, as any proper Homo sapien should. I mean, this is similar to the research on dropouts and pushouts that anthropologists conducted in the 1970s. They found out that a lot of the kids dropping out were being pushed out in a sense. They were in a toxic environment, and they did what any smart Homo sapien would do, which is get out of there. So putting a lens on it like that, I think, could help them as well as help us, in community colleges, at least, better help, this condition. Um, what I ended up developing was a typology of roles. And this is what I'm kind of analyzing here. And I just want to read, I'm going to jump ahead because I know I'm running out of time. I want to read several of the subjects, their roles and their self-definitions in terms of what they said and what roles they got fit into, in terms of their, due to their interactions with these centers. Um, Many people arrive at the community development centers are ostensibly looking for work to the extent that they are unemployed and often poor. Examples index a variety of paths that these centers have enabled, though. For example, Elisa, 18-year-old Mono Indian teen mom who first arrived at the center for supports for her baby. This was a place that did a lot of care for babies as well. They had a nurse on staff and all that. Then, she attended some resume workshops at the center and ended up working at the front desk of the center. So instead of, using the resume to get a job elsewhere, she ended up working right at the center. Manuel, a 22-year-old male of Mexican descent who began visiting the center as a freshman in high school. Um, Although reluctant at first, he since joined a member of the support groups that are, tangential to this organization, housed in this organization, and is a group leader in one of them currently. Um, so again, he's hanging out at the periphery, and then he finds himself hanging out, closer to the core. The Marcos, another male client of Mexican descent, had initially arrived at the center to support his girlfriend and infant child. His participation in that center enabled him to volunteer, then find work as a staff member at an associated thrift shop. Juan, a 22-year-old Latino male member, became associated with the center through one of the associated programs, the thrift shop. Once at the center, he reported, being helped, helped to get a job at the associated thrift shop. So going back to the center helped him get a job at one of the thrift shops. Daniela, 22-year-old Chicana, heard about the center from a presentation at a nearby university and applied for a position. So all of these cases, we see, this trajectory. You think you're going to go there for one thing, and you end up going there for another. My student assistants, I had two of them. One thing, they had to commit to 1 year of service, or they couldn't be even gotten in the door. And then beyond that, in their field notes, frequently, they'd be heading home to their car, going to a class, and they say, "Hey, could you help us unload the, a package of stuff?" So they were treated like they had a shift. But beyond the shift, they ended up getting volunteered into things more so. All of the full-time employees had to do all the weekend things. This is not like a bad coercive sort of environment. I'm not trying to sell that. It's more, in fact, if I put all of these on the typologies on a continuum, I really, embrace this one particular development center that throughout it was imbued with this sense of volunteerism. Volunteerism seemed to be everybody. If you want to be involved here, if you want to learn here, if you want to work here, if you want to be an intern here, everybody's pitching in. So it was a really great spirit of it. But just what I'm speaking to is the policymakers. They're not seeing any of this, and that's the kind of the ironic point. In conclusion, I just say that the problems facing disconnected youth are only slightly diminished by the improving economy, and this is before the pandemic. And I'm sure that since the pandemic, it's made things far, far worse. but with a richer understanding of how disconnected youth become members of the workforce or go back to the educational institutions, improved services could be investigated to better inform educational leaders in this area. So that was my final slide. I just wanted to give one shout out to Paulette. She was my student assistant and did most of the great work at the center. Paulette Campos Melchor. She graduated, but she's now doing a PhD actually in at the University of Oregon in anthropology. So very excited about her. I will stop sharing here. And we can open this wide for any questions or comments from anyone. Thank you, Brandy. And again, thank you for all the presenters, Dr. Mendoza, Dr. Yee. This was a very good event. I hope all of you enjoyed it as well. And again, we didn't have as much discussion as we kind of hoped, but someone took my biological anthro class. Thank you. But all of the questions and all the topics that came up are, food for thought, particularly in the higher ed case, for all of us, either current or future educational leaders. So it's a worthy topic, all of these topics. Okay. Also remember to attend our next session. Our next session is session 3. I think it's breakout session 3, right? Yeah, and at the same time as the breakout sessions is Dr. Yee's. I don't have the thing in front of me. Dr. Yee, do you want to mention that? Give a plug for your presentation.
Thank you. Yeah, we have our next session starting at 1:45, and we have 3 strands, but the 4th strand is we'll have our healers, our second-year healers presenting their e-portfolios. And so I know I see a couple of healers here, so I encourage you to please attend to support our e-portfolio project students.
And also the article, one of the publications that came out of my study is in the, there's a folder that Nicole and Cecilia made for this, and it's in there if you want to read further on that. And I know the other presentation drafts or slides are in there as well. So without further ado, thank you. Thank you again for attending, and we hope to see you at the next session.
Thank you all.
Thank you.